buddy Don thought he was doing his wife a favor, so he took one of her plants and he put that plant inside the bowl. And of course the bowl was just a bowl. And unfortunately, being wood, the moisture had some pretty negative effects on the wood. Not only on the wood, but on the glue joints itself. So one of the first things that happened is one of the glue joints let go, and the entire disc, which is the bottom, sort of spread apart. And I'll show you that here in a minute. I'll give you a close-up. And the second thing that happened is because of the amount of pressure that was put on the rim of the bowl, it actually split the rim itself, split one of the joints on the rim. So I've got to fix that split. That's the first thing I've got to do, is I've got to glue this rim of the bowl back up. And then I'm going to have to do a repair to the bottom of this, which unfortunately I'm not going to be able to squeeze this back in to close it up, because the amount of pressure that is on this wood because of the way the wood split once it started to shrink. I'm not going to be able to squeeze it back together. I've tried actually using a couple methods. I've tried using straps, ratchet straps. I can't even begin to budge this thing. And so I'm going to have to do a different kind of repair on this. Once I've done that repair, I'm going to have to resize or reshape this disc that is the bottom so that it fits into the recess that Gina's father had cut into this in order for the bottom disc to fit. So before we do the repair, let me take a few minutes and explain to you why this bottom disc failed the way that it did. Now, if any of you have ever split firewood before, and you've split firewood that is freshly cut out of the tree, as that firewood begins to dry, or as that log begins to dry, for those of you that have done this, know that that tree or that log will begin to split around this radial dimensions. And the radial dimensions is around the outside of the circumference of the tree itself. So wood shrinks as it dries, and as the moisture or the free moisture leaves the cell structure of the tree or the wood, again, it begins to shrink. But it shrinks as a percentage of its width. So for instance, in a radial cut, so going from the outside of the tree to the center of the tree, as the wood dries and it shrinks at a percentage of its width, it's going to shrink a larger amount or a larger volume at its widest point than it's going to shrink at its narrowest point. So therefore, when it shrinks, you always get this sort of wedge effect in the crack or the split that occurs. Well, the same thing has happened here. Gina's father, when he built these, he built them using kiln drying wood, and I'm actually familiar with the wood that he used because my friend Don, he worked for Ruger Firearms right along with me, and this wood came out of the scrap bins for the Ruger gunstock department or division. And so I'm very familiar with this wood. I'm very familiar with how it's dried. I'm very familiar with how it moves in shrink and swell as it goes through the seasons. So he used these scrap pieces of gunstock wood to build this. But what Gina's dad did is he made these perfect wedges. And by using those perfect wedges and having those wedges come together in the center, there's basically zero dimension at its narrowest point. And then you have that is what looks like it's apparently about a 2-inch wedge at its widest point. So the wood, when Don introduced the moisture to it, and the moisture released the glue joint, well, that wood was already in tension. That was in a lot of tension. And when it split and when it let go, there's a large gap here on the very edge, but there's a very narrow to zero gap down in the center of this disc. Now the reason that I can tell that this was under a lot of tension before Don's putting the plant in it is because this disc has a huge hollow in it. I don't know if I can show you that hollow or not. There's about a 3/16 to 1/4 inch gap, whereas the straight edge is touching flat on the outer edge. And if I were to roll this over, you can see that there's a lot of rock in this, in the straight edge. So that disc, as it was shrinking inside the bowl, was putting so much tension that it was starting to bow the disc or the bottom of the bowl. So when Don introduced that moisture into the bowl by putting the planter in it, that glue line released, it exploded outward, and that's what caused the break in the side of this thing as well. Literally, it was so much stress, so much tension that the bowl sides couldn't take the tension. All right, so how am I going to fix this? Well, I'm going to glue this up, and that's going to be relatively easy because I'm just going to add some, I'm going to use epoxy. Instead of using glue, one of the problems with this bowl is it's already got finish on it. So if I use glue, then I'm going to end up getting some glue down inside the finish. Whereas if I use epoxy, the epoxy is going to be really strong, but then using either denatured alcohol or probably I'll use mineral spirits. Once I've got this under tension, I can then use the mineral spirits to clean off all the epoxy residue. So it won't even show when I'm done. The disc, the bottom disc, is going to be a little bit more work. Again, as I said, I can't squeeze it in, I can't pull it in, so I'm going to have to make a wedge. And the wedge that I'm going to make is going to be made out of walnut. But as you've already learned, if you've been on the channel long enough, I worked for Ruger for over 40 years, and I have my own stash of this exact walnut from over the years in my wood supply. So I'm going to simply go into my supply of wood or my stash and find a piece of American walnut that happens to duplicate to the walnut that Gina's dad used. And I'm going to come up with something really pretty close. And then I'm going to have to cut that wedge so that wedge fits in there nice and tight. And at the end of it, once I fit it in, and do some really light sanding because I don't want to affect too much of Gina's dad's original finish. So once I get that wedge to fit in there, then what I'll do is add some finish back. And when it's done, when it's back in the bowl and it's in the bottom of the bowl, nobody's going to be the wiser. And if you see that wedge, my hope is, or my purpose is, that it looks like it was done on purpose and that it doesn't stand out and doesn't ruin the effect or the aesthetics of that bowl. Let's go ahead and get this thing fixed. Now before I apply the epoxy, I want to clean out that joint, clean out any old glue residue or any other residue that might be in there. So to get access to it, what I did is I used the small screwdriver, and I put that screwdriver in there to wedge this apart. And then with this thing wedged apart, I can get in there and clean up those surfaces. So I've got a piece of 180 sandpaper wrapped around a file, and I'm not trying to sand a lot off, just wanting to get some of that residue cleaned up and make sure that the new glue surface is as clean as it can be. The nice thing about epoxy is the epoxy is a little bit tenacious in that it'll stick to a lot of things without without a huge amount of prep work needed. Clean away. It's interesting though, as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing very, very little glue spread. So I'm not entirely sure what Gina's dad used for glue, but it is possible that this one joint was starved a little bit for glue, and that may be why it was the glue joint that let go. But frankly, it's good that it let go, because I'd rather see this thing split at a glue joint than the wood itself. That would have been a mess to fix. That actually looks pretty good. All right. So we're going to leave that split apart. I'm going to mix up my epoxy, and then we'll get that epoxy in there. Then we'll bring it together, clamp it up, and that part will be ready to go back together. Now, we've talked before in previous videos about which epoxy that I prefer to use. This is 12 to 24 hour epoxy. I prefer that, as I stated in an earlier video, because it gives me more open time or work time. A lot of people today, look at this 5-minute epoxy and think that the time saving alone is worth that, so they can get right back to using to using whatever it is that they're trying to repair. And I've said in a previous video that one of the problems with that 5-minute epoxy, not only is the open time not there that you need, but the glue tends to, or the epoxy tends to crystallize, and it doesn't seem to take, in my estimation, as solid a repair or as solid a joint as the 24-hour epoxy. I'm not going to be too concerned about getting it onto the finish to begin with, because again, with the mineral spirits, I should be able to get most of that off the finish or the finished surface. Just want a good coating. All right, so we've got that done. Now I don't know if you can see this or not, but when I pull that screwdriver out, you can see some of that epoxy begin to squeeze out. Yeah, it looks really good. I want to make sure my alignment is right, so I'm going to put a little pressure down on the table. I have this oversized wood clamp that will go down and bridge both of the sides of this. All right, when I get this cleaned up, I'm going to put a little bit of tape on it to sort of keep this aligned at the joint. But let's go ahead and get the epoxy cleared away from that finish as quickly as we can. And once again, as I said, I'm using mineral spirits to thin the epoxy. It works really well. Now, epoxy, as I've told you in previous videos, does not require a lot of pressure, not like wood glue. So it needs enough to close the gap, but not so much that it squeezes too much of the epoxy out, because the epoxy does become part of the structure of whatever you're using it to glue to. So I'm sort of comparing it to the other glue joints, and I'm not seeing anything that I'm particularly worried about, and I don't believe either Dawn nor Gina will know the difference once it glues up or solidifies. bit of tension. All right, that looks good. Next thing we need to work on is the disc, so let's get started on making that wedge. I went through my supply of walnut and found a chunk of walnut that is very similar in grain and color to the original disc. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to moisten the wood, the selection that we make, to make sure that when it darkens with stain, that it looks very similar to the color of the wood that we're actually working with. So usually you can use something like, again, back to the denatured alcohol or the mineral spirits, and we can wipe that on, and then we can get a sense of what the color is going to look like with the finish on. I cringe every time I see one of these wood dealers that they spray water on the wood. You never want to spray water. You want something that'll go on there that'll darken the wood and then evaporate, so that you're not having an effect on the grain structure or the pore structure or the moisture content of the wood. In this case, I'm just using some mineral spirits, and I've selected a section of the wood that I think will work or match that's here, and the section I'm going to take is going to be right in here. So I'm just darkening that by adding the mineral spirits, and you can see how it darkens it. And then when we put it up next to the piece that's there, you can see, I hope you can see, that it sort of matches the color of the piece of walnut that Gina's dad put in there. So I'm actually going to choose that piece of wood right out of this section right here. So I'll mark it somewhere in here that I want to take it out of this section here. We'll be making that wedge for that break. All right, so I'm over here at the bandsaw, and we're gonna cut this little piece out and get prepared to make that wedge as close to that fitting tolerance as we can. Now I'm going to pull that wedge out of this piece here, and somewhere in this area along in here will do it. So this is way too thick, so I'm going to thin this down again by about half. So the disc is roughly a ½ inch thick, and I've got the X marked on the top where the surface that I'm trying to mate to is. So I need to cut that wedge, and I've got a nice plain surface right along in here, and I'm going to try to use that plain surface as one of my wedge pieces, or one of the edges of the wedge. That way I'm not trying to work everything. So we need to actually draw the wedge that we want to make. Then I'm going to try and free cut it on the bandsaw and get it close enough that I can then begin to shape that wedge or size that wedge so that it fits in there as precisely as I can. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that this tapers down to 0, and it's going to be very difficult to taper this to get this to be an exact match, but we're going to do the best we can. Now in the back, at the widest point, the dimension is 91 thousandths. So this is going to be a pretty thin wedge that we're working with. So again, I'm going to use that surface that's already plain, and we'll go down to 0 from there. So we're going to sort of scrape this, and that'll leave me a line that I can follow I'm not sure how well that's going to show up on the video, but there's a line that was made by scribing it with the vernier, with the dial calipers. Then I have to figure out what my length is. So my length on the brake that I'm going to use is going to be about 3 inches. I'll be lucky to get anything that thin, that long. So we'll do 3 inches. I'm going to leave it a little long so that way when I get it done I can taper it. So I'll draw another line from 0, from 0 at this end, and then taper it out to where that line is that I made. And that'll create a full wedge. Now the wedge is going to be a little oversized, which is fine because my plan is to use sandpaper in order to do the final shaping. So I'm going to start here and bandsaw that wedge down to the 0 point, being on the outside of the line. Now the bandsaw actually does a pretty good job at making a fairly smooth cut. But even then, it's going to have some tooling marks that I'm going to have to sand out to get that wedge to fit. Now, I value my fingers quite a bit here, so I am going to use a push stick in order to cut this and to control it as I'm pushing it through. There's enough room on the back side over here that I can keep my fingers out of the way. So that's going to be my wedge. I taped a piece of 100 grit sandpaper down to my table saw. My table saw is very flat. And I used duct tape because, well, duct tape, And I'm going to start sanding that cut surface of the wedge with the sandpaper until I get a nice fit to the opening. Now I'm trying to remove the cut marks, and one of the things that I truly have to do is I have to get it thinned enough so that I can get it in as far as possible, and that's already looking pretty damn nice. I can control the thickness of the wedge in various locations along its length just by putting pressure in those parts of the wedge that I need to remove the most material from. So this is going to be tedious. It's going to take a little bit of time to do this hand fitting. So I'll bring it back when I'm closer and ready to glue it in. Alright, that looks really good. Altogether, that took me about 20 minutes of sanding. I had to make sure that when I was doing this, that my wedge down at the narrowest point was as close to 0 as I can get it, and because I wanted to get that wedge in as far as I can without spreading the disc out any more than it already is. The amount of little gap that's left here is so small that when I put the epoxy in, the epoxy will actually fill that in and it'll virtually disappear. All right, looks really good. Let's mix up some epoxy and get that wedge glued in. Because I can't really get my spatula down in there, at least why it's not very well, I'm going to put the epoxy actually on the edge of the wedge that I made. Now I'm not going to have to apply any direct pressure into the sides of the crack or sides of the split, because the wedge itself, once I force it in. Now I'm going to mount this or lay this over the wood that I cut this out of, because the wedge that I made is thicker than the thickness of the disc. So tomorrow, when I pull this apart, I'm going to go in with a sharp chisel, and then I'll chisel this away. So we're going to put this in, and that'll do the squeeze out. Now before I let this all set up too much, I do want to get away all that excess epoxy, just like we've been doing. All right, so that's a 24-hour cure. I'll see you tomorrow. All right, so the next day and the epoxy has dried. So our next goal, or our next job, is to really shape that wedge to the finished bowl. And we're going to try to use as much non-violent processes as we can. In other words, I'm not going to use any more machinery on this than I have to. So one of the first things that needs to be done is I have to get rid of this extra tab that was left over, because I made this, if you remember right, I made the wedge oversized. So I'm going to use a fretting saw to cut off that excess. So let's get that done. So now I've got this extra piece here. If you remember right, the disc is about a 1/2 inch thick, and I made this whatever the width of that block of wood is. So I need to get rid of this material, and I also need to get rid of the material on top as well. So what I decided to do was to take as much of this away with a hand chisel as I can. My goal is to get down as close to the finish as I can, and then do whatever final finishing I need to do with a fine piece of sandpaper. Just because I'm trying to preserve as much of Gina's dad's original finish as I can. So let's see if we can't get this pared down without scratching that original finish. Of course, this is just the craftsman's philosophy, the craftsman's methodology. Well, you want to do things as slowly and methodically as possible. The idea that you're not it's not like going into things with all guns blazing and just taking your time. All right, let me get this done and I'll bring you back on the other side. All right, so we've got the bulk of the material removed down to the original plate or the original disc. Next thing I want to do is take some light sandpaper and sort of sand that down to get it as close to the finish as I can. Now, I am going to have to do some light sanding on the original finish. I don't have a lot of choice in this because the water sort of stained this, so I am going to have to bring it down a little bit. But again, the bulk of that finish I want to try to leave intact. So I am going to use some light sandpaper and try to get that walnut wedge match sanded down as close as I can to the original. In this case, I'm using a piece of 180, and I'm going to try to do this with this file so that I can concentrate the amount of pressure into a narrower section. I've got that all done now. I had to end up going to 150 paper because the 180 wasn't quite aggressive enough to move that walnut. Walnut was a little harder than I thought it would be. So we get this, and we're pretty darn close. And the last thing I've got to do before I end up doing the finish sand and the adding the finish is I've actually got to fit the bottom to the bowl. And I mentioned to you that it had expanded when that glue joint let go. The disc expanded, and now because it expanded, I can't get it to fit into the original recess that was the bowl's design. So I'm going to take this over to my platen sander, and we'll set up, and we'll just start removing material very gradually until that bowl sits down inside there. So let me bring you over to the platen sander and let's start doing that. So essentially the bowl's all repaired. Now the last thing I need to do is do a real light finish sand to sort of blend in my repair to the original finish. I tried to stay away from Gina's dad's finish as much as I could. But again, I'm going to do just a really light sand with probably a 220 maybe, or maybe a 320 paper, just to blend all that in. And then I'll go back with one of my personal favorite finishes, and I add that, and it'll blend very well with Gina's finish. I'm not going to have to touch the most visible part of the bowl, which is the side. And when it's done, you're hardly even going to know the repairs done, which is the point. All right. I have this sanding block that I made years ago. It's this piece of machined walnut. I machined one edge very flat. Then I glued this piece of rubber to it, and the idea of the rubber is to give some give to the sandpaper as you're doing it. So the idea is that you don't create any hard edges with it. So this is 320 paper. I did decide to go with the 320. It's the same thing that if you've ever done woodworking, it's the same thing. You try to sand with the grain. Again, just really light sanding. Gina's dad stamped and signed and dated this over here, so I'm gonna stay right away from that. Sure, that's important to her, and it would be to me as well. Just wanting to scuff it up a little bit so that when I put my finish on, it'll have something to stick to. Of course, this is the most beautiful surface of the disc. All right, let's do the same thing on the inside. The inside I'm not quite as concerned about because the inside is the side of any bowl that takes the most beating, because that's where everything gets put. Preferably done, not another plant. There's a little bit of a ring from the planter where the water leaked out. I'm not going to be able to get that completely out, but we'll get it close. Boy, that staining is deep. That's pretty good. It's gotten so I can't even barely tell where the wedge is. I like this. This is all right. Now the last thing I need to do before I apply the finish is I need to glue the bottom disc back into the bowl ring itself. Rather than glue it, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to use some epoxy, and rather than glue the entire rim of the disc, what I'm going to do is put little tabs of epoxy in each of these wedges, because this thing is going to continue to move over the seasons. It'll shrink and it'll swell. And what I want to do is give that wood some freedom to do that. So by putting in these dots of epoxy and then bringing it down, that wood will have that ability to move within the bowl itself, and it's much less likely to want to expand. And then I mentioned earlier how we got a concave, so that'll help prevent that under tension from wanting to shrink and then pull itself into that bowl. So we're going to literally give the wood the opportunity to move like nature wants it to. So I'm just going to put small dabs of epoxy. It's not going to take a lot to hold this, and we'll probably do the center of each of those wedges. So we've got that done. Gina's dad had a pattern that he used, and this came apart, so I don't remember what the pattern is. But what I'm going to try to do is center each of the wedges to these vertical lines or vertical pieces that he installed, so that we'll center that to each of those pieces, and that way each of these things, each of these vertical pieces will then draw your eye into center. Again, I don't know if that's what Gina's dad intended, but I'm just trying to find some kind of rhythm to how this got installed. Let me get in with some mineral spirits to pull away any of that overrun that the epoxy might have squeezed out. So because the epoxy is a 24-hour cure, we're going to let this sit overnight, and then we'll come back tomorrow and put the finish on, and then we'll be done. Then we'll close this video out. Let's unclamp this. And the last thing that we need to do is apply the finish. So the bowl is nice and tight. The epoxy obviously did what it was supposed to do. As I mentioned earlier, I gave the original finish a light scuff so that the new finish would have something to grip onto. So I'm ready to do that. Let's put some finish on this thing. Now, I've talked about this before. I have this finish that I mix, and I've pre-mixed this, and I'm going to apply it. And I'm going to use just an old t-shirt because I need something soft that's going to allow me to get into those recesses in order to get that finish on there. And the finish is going to somewhat mimic the original color. One of the problems is this bowl is old enough that it started to take on the color that all would sort of take on these colors as the sunlight begins to have its effect on the wood. So I'm going to just add in this finish. And one thing that I'm never going to be able to replicate completely is those years of darkening or yellowing that occurs naturally to the wood. I could add in some stain or some kind of a color, but I'm not going to do that. I just need to protect the bowl, and the wood will begin to take on the patina all by itself as it ages, and that'll be fine. This is already starting to darken. So this was a little bit longer video today, and for those of you who made it all the way through, I really appreciate you. I'm going to give the finish a few hours to dry, and when it has, I'm going to take some photographs, and I'll show you at the end of the video the before and the after, so to give you the perspective of how this thing came out. Like I said, I'm really pretty pleased with it. Gina, Dawn, happy anniversary. You guys have been together for so long. And I'm glad to call you my friends. Gina, be good to Don, okay? He didn't do this on purpose. He really thought he was helping you out. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ring that bell so you get notified the next time I post a video. I'll see you in the next one.